Imagine waking up, grabbing your phone, and seeing an emergency text message from your government. And they're practically begging you, and like a billion of your fellow citizens, to just completely stop buying the one specific thing that guarantees your family's wealth.
Right. The one thing that secures their social standing and their future.
Exactly. And the government isn't asking for, a brief pause. They're pleading for an absolute halt for an entire year.
Which is just, I mean, it's wild to think about.
It sounds like the opening scene of a dystopian movie, honestly. But as of May 2026, this is not a drill. It is happening right now in India. And the craziest part about all of this desperate, unprecedented attempt to stop citizens from buying traditional wedding jewelry is it's directly impacting the value of the retirement account sitting in your name right now.
It really is one of the most remarkable economic events of the decade. We are witnessing this moment where deeply entrenched human culture is just, well, it's colliding at full speed with cold, hard macroeconomic survival.
Yeah, and so for today's deep dive, we are pulling back the curtain on this collision and the shockwaves it's sending through global financial markets. We're working off a highly detailed, deeply researched report by Doug Young.
Oh, yeah, Doug's work is fantastic.
Right. He's a financial markets researcher with over 20 years of experience. And this analysis was recently published on the Gold IRA Company's Bulletin. We've also stacked that up alongside some very fresh market data regarding global precious metals.
Doug Young's analysis is particularly valuable here because, he has spent more than 15 years specifically focused on this sector. So the way he tracks how a domestic policy panic in one hemisphere fundamentally rewires global supply chains in another is, well, it's incredibly rigorous.
Definitely. So our mission today is to decode how this perfect storm happened. Like, how does a local cultural tradition get swept up in global geopolitics? And, why does that eventually hit your wallet?
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start with the breaking news itself because the sheer scale of the government intervention is just staggering. Yeah, the anchor of this entire situation is an extraordinary public appeal made by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He addressed the nation and basically asked his 1.4 billion citizens to voluntarily suspend all gold jewelry purchases.
And he was pretty specific, right?
Very specific. He targeted festivals, weddings, special occasions, asking for a moratorium of at least 1 year. But, I mean, the government clearly knew a polite request wouldn't be enough.
Obviously not.
Right. So overnight, they enacted this brutal emergency hike on the import duties for gold and silver. They slammed the tax rate from 6% all the way up to 15%.
Wow. Just a massive, violent jump in the cost of doing business. To really ground this for you, imagine the government asking Americans to voluntarily stop buying turkey at Thanksgiving.
That's a great way to look at it.
But you have to amplify that cultural weight by about 1,000. Because in India, gold is not just, a holiday meal you consume and forget about. It is tangible family wealth. It's literal security.
What's fascinating here is the economic concept of inelastic demand and how it maps perfectly onto Indian culture. When economists classify demand as inelastic, they're basically saying that consumers are going to buy the product regardless of how high the price goes.
The demand just doesn't stretch.
Exactly. It doesn't yield to market pressure. In India, gold is the absolute center of wedding traditions. A bride's gold jewelry isn't just a decorative accessory for the ceremony. It literally represents her family's honor and serves as her own personal future financial stability.
Right, so you can't just opt out.
No, you cannot simply pull a family aside and say, well, gold is trading a little high this quarter, maybe we skip the dowry jewelry. It is entirely non-negotiable.
And it goes way beyond weddings, too. You have these massive cultural and religious festivals like Diwali and Akshaya Tritiya, where the act of buying gold is considered highly auspicious. It is actively believed to bring good fortune.
It is multi-generational wealth storage. For centuries, families have passed physical gold down as a hyper-secure store of value that survives whatever economic crises or political instability the era throws at them.
Yeah, it outlasts governments.
Right. So when the prime minister makes this public appeal, he is effectively bypassing all the traditional, sterile, market-based policy tools, like adjusting interest rates, and he's walking right into the living rooms of 1.4 billion people to ask them to override their own deep-seated cultural programming.
Which tells me that a government does not risk that level of massive cultural backlash unless its back is completely against the wall. I mean, they have to be terrified of a larger collapse. So to understand why the government is risking this, we have to look at what's actually breaking down behind the scenes. What is happening to India's economy to trigger such a desperate move?
Well, it's a chain reaction that actually starts thousands of miles away from India's borders. The source material traces this crisis back to escalating geopolitical tensions and conflict in the Middle East. That instability causes global energy prices to spike violently.
And India is a massive net importer of oil, right? They don't produce enough energy domestically to keep their lights on, run their factories, or keep their supply chains moving, so they're forced to buy it on the global market.
Yeah, heavily dependent.
So when oil prices skyrocket, India's national energy bill just goes through the roof.
Which forces a massive widening of their trade deficit. The report notes that India's merchandise trade deficit widened to a staggering $330 billion in 2026. To put that in perspective, it was $280 billion in 2025.
Wait, that is a $50 billion jump in a single year?
It's catastrophic.
Right.
And we need to clarify what a trade deficit actually is. It simply means that significantly more money is bleeding out of the country to buy foreign goods than is coming in from selling domestic goods.
Oh.
And that bleed directly impacts the Reserve Bank of India, the RBI.
Because they have to actually pay for that expensive imported oil.
Precisely. And you cannot pay for Saudi or Iranian oil using Indian rupees. Global commodity markets operate almost entirely on foreign currencies, overwhelmingly the US dollar. So the RBI has to drain its own foreign exchange reserves to cover the bill.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, the data shows those reserves plummeted by about $40 billion in recent months. And when a central bank starts desperately dumping its own currency into the market to buy up US dollars, it fundamentally shifts the supply and demand.
I get it. So think of the foreign exchange market like a massive global auction. If India is constantly throwing huge piles of rupees into this auction to buy US dollars so they can buy oil, there is suddenly this massive oversupply of rupees floating around.
Yes, exactly.
And just like anything else, when the supply of something drastically increases, its value drops, which is why the rupee hit a historic low, falling below 95.5 per US dollar.
That is the exact mechanism. The currency is losing its purchasing power on the global stage.
Okay, wait. I have to push back on the government's strategy here. Because traditionally, isn't a country holding a massive amount of gold a very good thing for its wealth? Like, if the citizens are hoarding physical gold, isn't that the ultimate sign of financial security? Why is the government treating imported gold like it's some sort of economic toxin that needs to be eradicated?
It's a brilliant question, and to answer it, we have to look at what we can call the foreign currency trap. It comes down to the raw import data. Gold accounts for 11% of India's total merchandise imports. The only single commodity they import more of is crude oil, which makes up 22%.
Okay, so to use an analogy, imagine your household only has a limited stash of arcade tokens, and in this case, those are US dollars, to use at a specific store.
Right.
You desperately need those tokens to buy groceries, which is the oil, just to survive the week, but your family keeps taking those same limited tokens and using them to buy luxury jewelry, the gold. Eventually, the head of the household has to step in and say, stop spending our tokens on gold, or we literally will not be able to buy food.
That is exactly what is happening on a macroeconomic scale. Both gold and oil require foreign currency, US dollars, to purchase. When the government looks at its rapidly depleting vault of dollars, it faces a brutal existential choice.
Yeah.
Do we spend our last remaining dollars importing gold so families can celebrate weddings? Or do we spend those dollars importing oil so we can keep the electricity grid from collapsing and the hospitals running? Energy must win out.
It has to. You can't run a country on dowry jewelry.
You cannot. The government cannot print US dollars. They can only conserve the ones they have. Which is why the Prime Minister's appeal went even further than just gold.
Right.
He also urged citizens to work from home when possible, to reduce their personal oil consumption, and he pleaded with them to halt any unnecessary overseas travel.
Because every time they travel, they take those dollars out.
Exactly, because every time a citizen travels abroad, they are taking those precious foreign dollars out of the country. They were trying to slap a tourniquet on every single financial artery.
So the math makes complete logical sense on a spreadsheet. But as we know, human behavior rarely follows a spreadsheet. Here's where it gets really interesting. We have to look at the policy whiplash that happened, because the government's approach to this has been wildly contradictory.
Oh, absolutely.
Just 10 months prior to this crisis, in July of 2024, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman actually cut the gold import duty. She dropped the tax from 15% down to 6%. The stated goal was to liberalize the market and stimulate formal legal trade. But now, in May 2026, the emergency brake is pulled and the duty is violently yanked right back up to 15%.
And that rapid policy reversal created absolute chaos. Markets despise uncertainty, but they absolutely love front-loading a crisis.
Which makes perfect behavioral sense, because if I am an investor or a jewelry manufacturer in India and I see the rupee falling and oil prices rising, I can read the writing on the wall.
You know what's coming.
Yeah, I know the government is eventually going to have to hike import taxes on gold to stop the dollar drain, so I'm not going to wait. I am going to back up the truck
Yeah.
and buy as much gold as I possibly can today before the tax goes up.
And that collective realization triggered a historic panic. In the first quarter of 2026, sensing this incoming tax hike, the market rushed in. India's gold imports doubled, hitting $25 billion.
Doubled. Wow.
Yes. That represents an 83% average monthly increase compared to the previous year. People were so desperate to get physical gold into the country before the door slammed shut that they were willing to pay absurd markups, pushing premiums to $112 per ounce.
It's the ultimate self-fulfilling prophecy. In trying to avoid a crisis, the fear of the crisis caused everyone to drain the foreign reserves even faster. And then the door did slam shut. The aftermath of the announcement in May was brutal.
Very brutal.
By raising the duty back to 15%, the actual tax burden on imported gold more than doubled. It jumped from 6,000 rupees to 15,000 rupees per 100,000 of value. That aggressive penalty pushed domestic prices in India to an all-time record high of 159,100 rupees per 10 grams. And the import volume just fell off a cliff.
It plummeted.
Yeah, in April, imports collapsed by 75%, dropping from a robust average of 60 tons a month down to barely 15 tons.
On paper, the government got exactly what it wanted. But we have to look at the long-term reality of human behavior. The report brings in some highly critical analysis from Charles Gave, an economist at Gavekal Research. He's highly skeptical that this 50% duty is actually going to kill the underlying demand for gold.
Because of that inelastic cultural demand we established earlier, like the weddings are still happening.
Precisely. When demand is deeply rooted in religious belief and family honor, a government price hike doesn't destroy the demand, it simply drives it underground. We have historical precedent for this. We saw this exact same scenario play out during the 2013 currency crisis in India.
What happened then?
Well, they hiked duties to 10% back then. And it didn't stop people from buying gold. It just created a massive, highly organized incentive for smuggling. When the legal taxed route becomes prohibitively expensive, illicit trade across borders with neighboring countries suddenly becomes a wildly lucrative enterprise.
Which is the worst-case scenario for the government. Because the citizens are still using wealth to buy gold, meaning the foreign currency is still bleeding out of the broader economy into the black market. But now the government doesn't even get to collect the tax revenue on it. It is a total lose-lose.
It creates a shadow economy that actively works against the central bank's recovery efforts.
So we've outlined the crisis in India, but I want to pivot directly to you, the listener. If you are listening to this right now in the United States or anywhere else in the world outside of South Asia, why should you care about a sudden tax hike on wedding jewelry in Mumbai?
You must care because of the sheer scale of India's gold market. It is almost impossible to overstate its size. Indian households currently hold an estimated $3.8 trillion in physical gold.
Wait, trillion with a T.
Yes, trillion. That single asset class is equivalent to roughly 90% of the country's entire gross domestic product. They are the second largest consumer of gold on the planet, trailing only China. When a market of that terrifying magnitude experiences a sudden, violent policy shift, the shockwaves do not stay contained within its borders.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Doug Young report outlines 3 direct ways this foreign policy panic hits your wallet. Let's start with spot price volatility. For those who might not follow the commodities market daily, the spot price is simply the current price it costs to buy a physical asset right now, on the spot.
And that spot price is incredibly sensitive to demand. Remember that massive panicked buying spree in the first quarter of 2026, when India was importing $25 billion worth of gold in a matter of months? That voracious, concentrated demand was a primary driver in pushing global spot gold prices near an astonishing $5,000 an ounce. So if you are a U.S. investor, particularly if you hold a precious metals IRA or physical gold, as a hedge for your retirement, the actual daily value of your portfolio is being directly manipulated by the buying habits and policy panics happening 8,000 miles away.
It is wild to think that your retirement account is literally fluctuating based on the intensity of wedding season in another hemisphere. And that brings us to the second major impact, which is the currency seesaw.
This is a crucial economic mechanism to understand. Currencies do not exist in a vacuum. They are valued relative to one another. When a major emerging market currency like the Indian rupee weakens significantly against the US dollar because they're dumping rupees to buy oil, it artificially alters global trade dynamics.
Right.
A weaker rupee generally means a relatively stronger US dollar in the global market.
And on the surface, a strong US dollar sounds like a great thing for Americans, but it actually has incredibly complicated ripple effects for the average consumer, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
A hyper-strong dollar can make U.S. exports much more expensive for other countries to buy, which hurts American manufacturing and agriculture. Furthermore, if massive emerging markets are struggling to buy energy because their local currencies are weak, that instability shifts global commodity prices across the board.
Everything moves.
The cost of raw materials fluctuates, supply chains reroute, and eventually, that volatility trickles down to the prices you pay at your local grocery store or hardware store. Everything in the global economy is intrinsically connected.
Which leads perfectly into the third major impact, global supply chain chaos. When Indian demand for gold fluctuates this violently, doubling in one quarter and then dropping 75% the very next month, it creates absolute nightmares for global supply logistics.
Total nightmare.
If India suddenly stops buying, all that global supply might suddenly shift toward China, altering trade routes. If Indian jewelry manufacturers have to shut down their operations because raw materials are too expensive to import legally, that immediately affects jewelry retailers and manufacturers worldwide.
And if Charles gave is right, and this tax hike leads to an explosion of smuggling, it creates enormous systemic challenges for international trade. It throws a massive wrench into global efforts to ensure responsible sourcing of precious metals and combat money laundering. The regulatory framework of the entire global precious metals industry gets destabilized when one of its biggest players goes underground.
So if you're sitting there evaluating how these tectonic global market shifts might affect your own long-term retirement strategies, it's vital to have objective, comprehensive information.
Absolutely.
The factual source material for today's deep dive comes from the Gold IRA Company's Bulletin. They offer a highly detailed resource for head-to-head comparisons of gold IRA providers, which can be incredibly useful if you are trying to navigate this exact kind of global volatility with your own assets. You can find their research at goldiracomaniescompared.com.
It is a critical tool for understanding how to position your portfolio when global markets are reacting unpredictably to these unprecedented policy shifts.
So, to briefly recap the journey we've been on today, we started with a geopolitical shock. Tensions in the Middle East caused a massive spike in global oil prices. Because India relies so heavily on imported oil, that energy spike drained their central bank's U.S. dollar reserves, triggering a severe currency crisis that crashed the value of the rupee.
Right.
To stop the financial bleeding, the Indian government was forced to intervene in a sacred cultural tradition, practically begging its citizens to stop buying gold and hiking taxes to punitive levels. And because Indian households hold nearly $4 trillion in gold, that local policy panic sent massive shockwaves all the way out into global precious metals pricing, international supply chains, and directly into your retirement portfolio.
It is a flawless illustration of how deeply and inherently interconnected the modern financial system truly is. But looking at all of this data, this raises an important question, one that I think is the most profound, lingering takeaway from this entire crisis.
Lay it on us.
Think carefully about the behavior of the Indian citizens during that first quarter of 2026. Their national government was facing a severe, undeniable economic crisis. Their national currency, the rupee, was failing on the global stage. And what was the immediate instinctual reaction of the population?
They bought gold.
They didn't trust the banking system. They rushed to buy physical gold. They bought so much, so fast, that it doubled national import volumes. They instinctively used a physical asset as a hedge against their own failing currency. Now, fiat currencies are the paper money we use every day, backed by nothing but our trust in the government that issues them.
Yeah.
If a powerful national government is completely unable to legislate away its citizens' desire to hold physical gold during a genuine emergency, even when they practically beg them to stop and tax them heavily for it, what does that ultimately tell us about the underlying fragility of modern fiat currencies? And more importantly, what does it reveal about the fundamental global trust in the paper money printed by governments versus the tangible physical assets held directly in people's hands?
Wow. That is a heavy, profound thought to leave off on. When the systemic cracks start to show, people don't run to the banks, they run to the vault. It definitely makes you look at the cash sitting in your wallet a little differently.
It really does.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up today's deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us and exploring the intricate, sometimes messy ways that human culture and global finance collide. If you want to dig deeper into the resources we utilize today, especially regarding how to navigate this volatility with your own retirement accounts, head over to goldracompaniescompared.com. That is gold, IRA, companiescompared.com. Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning the systems around you, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.